The morning Celia Covington signed her name to a marriage contract she had never asked for. The ink on the paper was barely dry before the man she was supposed to wed was already 3 days dead and buried in the red clay earth of Abilene, Kansas. It was the spring of 1874, and the dust that rolled through the town of Harlan's Creek sat low and thick against the horizon like a warning no one had heeded in time. Celia stood outside the office of Silas Drummond, the town's land broker and self-appointed keeper of all arrangements both financial and otherwise, with her hat pulled low against the April sun, and her jaw set in a way that her late father had always called her courthouse face. She was 26 years old, a woman of measured words and carefully guarded feelings, and she had spent the last 4 months watching everything her family had built slowly dissolve like salt in a warm glass of water. Her father, Edmund Covington, had died of a lung ailment the previous November, leaving behind 40 acres of good grazing land, a modest farmhouse with a leaking roof, a herd of 23 cattle, and a debt to the Harlan's Creek savings and loan that Celia had not known existed until the letter arrived 2 weeks after the funeral. The debt was not small. It was the kind of number that made a woman's throat go tight when she read it by lamplight alone at the kitchen table, her mother's old quilt pulled around her shoulders, and the sound of the wind pressing against the window panes like something that wanted in. The man Silas Drummond had arranged for her to marry was one Gerald Fitch, a rancher of 51 years who owned considerable land to the north of town, and who had made his interest in the Covington property known shortly after Edmund's death. Gerald Fitch had died of a heart episode on the second Tuesday of April, which left Celia with a signed contract, a debt, and no husband, a situation that Silas Drummond found enormously inconvenient, and Celia found almost grimly funny in the private spaces of her own heart, where she kept the things she could not say aloud. "There is another arrangement," Silas said to her that morning, his fingers pressed flat against the surface of his desk, the way a man presses his hands when he is about to say something he already knows will not land well. "A man by the name of Joel Easton has expressed interest." Celia looked at him steadily. "In my land. In a partnership. A union. He is a rancher who has recently come to Harlan's Creek. He has capital but no established homestead of the kind needed to run a proper cattle operation. Your land is precisely positioned. It borders Teller's Creek on the eastern edge, it has good grass, and the house is leaking," Celia said. "Structurally present," Silas said. "He would assume the debt. You would keep the land in your name as part of the arrangement. He has stated this explicitly." Celia said nothing for a long moment. Outside, a buckboard rattled past on the main road, and someone called out a name she didn't recognize. The whole world seemed to be going about its business with a casualness that struck her as faintly absurd. "How old is he?" she asked. 30 years. "Has he been married before?" "He has not." "Does he know what he is asking for?" Silas frowned. "He is asking for a wife, Miss Covington." "He is asking for my land," she said, and she picked up her hat from the arm of the chair and settled it back onto her head. "Tell him I will meet him." She did not say yes. She had not said yes yet. But the debt was real, and the land was real, and the spring was already pushing towards summer. And Celia Covington was not a woman who let sentiment stand in the way of what needed to be done. She met Joel Easton the following afternoon at the Harlan's Creek feed store, which was as neutral a piece of ground as any she could think of, public enough that no one could say anything improper and practical enough that she could judge a man by how he behaved when no one was putting on a performance. She arrived 5 minutes early, because she always arrived 5 minutes early to everything, and she was examining a sack of oat grain with the focus of a woman who genuinely cared about oat grain when she heard boots on the wooden floor behind her. She turned. He was tall, not extravagantly so, but the kind of tall that filled a doorway without effort. He wore a worn brown canvas coat over a pale blue shirt, and his hat was the color of old saddle leather, tilted back just enough that she could see his face clearly. It was a good face, she thought, which was an observation she made the way she might observe that a horse had good legs practically, and without romance attached to it. His eyes were dark brown and direct, and when he saw her, he did not smile immediately the way men sometimes did when they were trying to make a favorable impression. He just looked at her, steady and open, as if he was reading something he wanted to understand before he responded to it. "Miss Covington," he said. "Mr. Easton," she said. They shook hands, which was unusual enough in 1874 that the feed store owner glanced over from behind his counter before looking away again. Celia's grip was firm, so was his. "I expect you have questions," Joel said. "I have several," she said. "Shall we start with what you actually want?" He was quiet for a moment, considering this. "I want what I said I wanted, land with access to good water, a working cattle operation. A chance to build something that doesn't blow away in the first hard wind, and a wife attached to all of that." "Not attached to it," he said, and his voice was measured but not cold. "It is not the same thing. You would not be an attachment." She studied him. "You understand that what Silas Drummond arranged for me with Gerald Fitch was a transaction. You are proposing the same kind of transaction." "I am proposing a marriage," he said, "which is a different thing from a transaction, even when it begins that way." It was the most interesting thing anyone had said to her in months. She looked at him for a long moment, this stranger with his honest eyes and his worn coat and his strange ability to be direct without being unkind. "I will agree to the arrangement," she said at last, "on the condition that my name remains on the deed, that the debt is fully assumed by you with no claim made on the land itself in the event of complications, and that I am not required to abandon the running of the property in any capacity." Joel Easton nodded slowly, as if he were turning each of those conditions over in his mind the way a man turns stones to check their undersides. "All of that is agreeable," he said. "I have one condition of my own." She raised an eyebrow. "That you tell me when something is wrong," he said. "I cannot fix what I don't know about." It was so simple a thing to ask that it caught her somewhere she wasn't expecting. She swallowed carefully and kept her face even. "That is agreeable," she said. They were married 6 days later at the office of Justice Hartwell, with Silas Drummond and the feed store owner as witnesses, on a Thursday morning when the sky was the color of hammered copper, and a warm wind was coming in off the plains. Celia wore her good blue dress and a brooch that had belonged to her mother. Joel wore a clean white shirt and the same saddle leather hat, and when Hartwell asked him to place the ring on her finger, the ring was a simple silver band that caught the light without extravagance, and he slid it onto her hand with a steadiness that she noticed because she was paying attention to everything. When it was done and they stepped out into the street and the world continued around them as if nothing remarkable had happened, Celia stood for a moment beside her new husband and felt the strange suspended quality of a life that has just turned a corner into territory without a map. "Well," she said. "Well," Joel said. Then he offered his arm, and after a brief pause she took it, and they walked back to where their horses were hitched. The farmhouse was exactly as he had been told. The roof leaked in 2 places, the front porch had a rotting board third from the left, and the kitchen stove needed its flue pipe replaced before it could be used with any safety. Celia showed him these things with the directness of a woman who was not going to pretend the property was better than it was, and Joel walked through each room without comment until they had completed the circuit and were standing again in the main room, where the afternoon light came in at a low angle through the dusty window glass. "I can fix the roof within the week," he said. "The flue I can do tomorrow if you have the pipe." "I don't," she said, "but McKinney's Hardware will have it." "I will go in the morning." He looked around the room again. "It is a good house," he said quietly. "It just needs tending." Something about the way he said it made Celia think he was not entirely talking about the house. She chose not to remark on this. There were 2 bedrooms. This fact had occupied a portion of Celia's thoughts since the arrangement had been proposed, and she addressed it the way she addressed all uncomfortable subjects, which was directly and without unnecessary preamble. "The second bedroom is yours," she said. "My things are in the first. The arrangement requires a legal marriage and a functioning household. It does not require more than that." Joel looked at her without surprise and without offense. "That is fine," he said. "I appreciate you saying it plainly." She nodded. "I find plain speaking saves a great deal of trouble." "On that we agree," he said, and there was something in his voice that might have been the beginning of a smile, though it didn't quite reach his expression fully, and she turned away before she could determine whether it had or not. The first week was a negotiation of domestic territories conducted mostly through the careful choreography of two people who were strangers, but trying not to be inconvenient to each other. Celia made coffee before sunrise and had it ready when Joel came in from the morning check on the cattle. Joel repaired the roof in 3 days, working steadily from first light until the shadows grew long, and he did not ask for help, but he also did not refuse it when Celia climbed the ladder herself with additional shingles, because she was not a woman who stood at the bottom and watched. "You've done this before," he observed when she set her knee against the ridge and passed him a shingle with the efficiency of someone who had done exactly this before. "My father's roof," she said. 2 years ago." She paused. "He wasn't well enough to do it himself by then. He didn't like that he wasn't, so I didn't make much of doing it." Joel took the shingle. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "He sounds like a man who took pride in his work." "He was," she said. "He was a good man who just ran out of time." They worked in silence for a while after that, the kind of silence that is not uncomfortable but rather companionable, the kind that grows between people who have found a shared rhythm and do not feel the need to fill it with unnecessary sound. Below them, the Kansas grassland spread out in every direction, yellow and green in the April light, and the cattle moved slowly near the eastern fence where Teller's Creek caught the sun. Joel noticed her watching the land. "You love it," he said. "It is mine," she said simply. "Both things can be true," he said. She looked at him. He was focused on hammering the shingle into place and wasn't looking at her, and she found that made it easier to study his profile without having to manage her own expression. He was, she thought again, a good-looking man in a quiet way, not showy about it. The lines of his face were honest. She looked back at the land. Over the following weeks, a pattern established itself. Joel rose early and worked the cattle. Celia managed the accounts, the kitchen garden she had planted in March, and the business of running the property with the organized attention she had always given to everything she cared about. They ate dinner together at the kitchen table every evening, and in those early weeks, the conversations were practical ones, about the cattle, about the fence line along the north pasture that needed reinforcing, about the market prices in Abilene, and whether it made sense to sell a portion of the herd in the summer or wait until fall. But gradually, inevitably, because two people who share a table every night cannot remain entirely practical forever, the conversations began to stray into other territories. She learned that he had grown up in Missouri, the second of 4 children, on a farm that had been swallowed by debt when the drought hit in '68. He had worked as a ranch hand in Texas for 3 years, saved with a determination she could hear in the stripped-down way he described it, and had come to Kansas specifically because the land was better priced and the grass was reliable. He had no family nearby. He wrote letters to a younger sister named Clara who lived in St. Louis and had married a shopkeeper, and the way he spoke of Clara was with a warmth that was unguarded in a way the rest of him wasn't quite yet. "She will want to know about you," he said one evening, as the lamplight shifted between them and the sound of crickets had risen outside. "I told her about the arrangement in a letter last week. What did you tell her?" Celia asked, watching him over the rim of her coffee cup. "The truth," he said, "that I had married a woman of considerable capability and plain speaking, and that I considered myself fortunate." Celia put down her cup. She looked at him with the careful expression she wore when she was deciding what to do with something unexpected. "That is a generous way to describe a business arrangement," she said. "It is an accurate way to describe it," he said. She was quiet for a moment. I find it difficult, she said slowly, to know what to do with generosity that has no obvious motive. Joel looked at her steadily. Not everything has a motive beyond the fact of it. She thought about that for a long time after she went to bed, lying in the dark with the sound of the spring wind against the house and the solid feeling of the land around her, the land that was still hers, and the strange new fact of someone on the other side of the bedroom wall who seemed to mean what he said. It was in May that the first real trouble came, and it came in the form of a man named Harlan Bode. Harlan Bode was the sort of man the West produced in abundance in those years, the kind who had learned that the machinery of law and banking could be used like a weapon if you knew which parts to push. He held 3 mortgages in the Harlan's Creek area and had a habit of waiting until a property was just vulnerable enough before he made his moves. He had been watching the Covington land for 2 years. He came on a Wednesday afternoon in the second week of May, riding up the road on a gray horse with 2 men behind him, and Celia was in the kitchen garden when she saw him coming. She straightened up from the bean rows and pulled off her gardening gloves with the slow deliberateness of a woman who is taking a moment to decide what she is going to be when the next thing happens. Joel was at the barn. She did not go to get him. She walked to the front porch and waited. Harlan Bode dismounted with the ease of a man who believed the earth arranged itself for his comfort. He was 53, heavyset, with a neat gray beard and the kind of expensive hat that was meant to indicate status. He smiled at Celia the way men sometimes smiled at women when they were confident the woman did not understand the game being played. "Mrs. Easton," he said, "I understand congratulations are in order." "Mr. Bode," she said, "I don't recall extending an invitation." His smile stayed where it was. "I was a friend of your father's." "My father spoke of you," she said, "not as a friend." The smile thinned. "I will be direct," he said. "There is a second note on this property. A private arrangement your father made 4 years ago that was separate from the savings and loan debt. I have recently acquired that note." Celia kept her face perfectly still. Inside, something cold moved through her chest. "I am not aware of any second note," she said. "Your father may not have mentioned it," Bode said pleasantly. "The amount is $1,800 due on the 1st of June. It was a number designed to be impossible. She could see that clearly. June 1st was 17 days away. No legitimate creditor gave 17 days' notice on a 4-year-old debt. She knew what this was. It was a construction, a trap made of paper. "You will need to present the documentation to my husband's attorney," she said. "Mr. Easton handles the financial affairs of this property." Bode's eyes moved past her shoulder. She heard boots on the porch boards behind her and knew, without looking, that Joel had come up from the barn. She did not step aside or move toward him. She stayed exactly where she was. "Mr. Bode," Joel said, coming to stand beside her. "Easton," Bode said, looking him over with the calculating assessment of a man deciding the weight of an obstacle. "Your wife and I were discussing a financial matter." "I heard some of it," Joel said. His voice was even, not hostile, not conciliatory, even. "Any documentation you have should be presented to Thomas Mercer in town. He handles our legal matters." They did not have a lawyer named Thomas Mercer. Celia knew this. She did not let her expression show it. Bode studied Joel for a moment, then looked at Celia, and whatever he saw in her face apparently told him this ground was less yielding than he had anticipated. He touched the brim of his hat. "I'll be in touch," he said. He rode away with his 2 men behind him, and the dust settled slowly in the road. Celia and Joel stood side by side on the porch and watched him go. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "We need an actual lawyer," Joel said quietly. "Thomas Mercer is real," she said. "He was my father's attorney. He moved to Dodge City last year. Do you have his address?" "I have a letter he sent last fall. I kept it." Joel turned to look at her. There was something in his expression she hadn't seen quite that clearly before, a focused, protective quality that was not about possessiveness, but about something steadier than that, about being the kind of person who stood next to someone when trouble arrived. "Can you write to him today?" "I will write to him this afternoon," she said. She paused. "There was no second note," she said. "My father told me everything. He would not have taken a private loan from a man like Bode without telling me." "I believe you," he said, and he said it without hesitation. The way a man says something he has already decided to be true. She looked at him. The afternoon sun was at his back and the wind was moving through the grass, and he was just standing there on her porch looking back at her like he intended to stay. "Thank you," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. He nodded. He went back to the barn. She went inside and sat at the desk that had been her father's, and wrote a letter to Thomas Mercer in Dodge City with the full force of her attention and a clarity of detail that she hoped conveyed the urgency. Thomas Mercer's reply arrived 10 days later, which was cutting the timeline very close to June 1st. He wrote that any note of that nature would need to be registered through the county recorder's office to be legally enforceable, and that Celia should request the official registry number and date of recording before engaging with the claim at all. If the note was fraudulent, as he suspected it might be, the absence of a legitimate recording would expose Bode to significant legal liability. Joel rode into town that same day and presented Bode's representative at the county office with a formal written request for the recording information. The representative stalled and redirected and ultimately could not produce a recording number because there was no recording number, because the note was exactly what Celia had said it was, a construction. Harlan Bode did not come back. That evening, when Celia set dinner on the table and they sat down across from each other, Joel poured 2 cups of coffee and pushed one toward her and said, "It's done," in a tone of voice that carried more than just those 2 words. Celia wrapped her hands around the cup. "He'll try something else eventually," she said. "Men like Bode don't stop." "I know," Joel said, "but we'll deal with that when it comes." He looked at her across the table. "Your father raised a good fighter." Celia laughed, and it surprised her slightly because it came out more freely than she was expecting, the kind of laugh that arrives before you've had time to consider whether to let it. She saw Joel's expression change when she laughed, something in it warming and opening up, and she noticed this and noted it the way she noted all significant things. "He said I argued like a circuit judge from the time I was 8 years old," she said. "He wasn't wrong," Joel said, and this time the smile reached his eyes entirely and stayed there. June arrived, and with it the full heat of the Kansas summer, which was not the polite warmth of spring but a deep, pressing heat that made the air shimmer above the road and the cattle congregate near the creek in the hottest part of the afternoon. Celia had grown up in this heat and moved through it with the ease of the accustomed. Joel worked in it without complaint, which she observed and respected. One evening in the middle of June, she came to the barn to tell him supper was ready, and found him sitting on a hay bale with a book open in his hands, a battered volume with a cloth cover so worn she couldn't read the title. He looked up when she came in, not startled, just present. "What are you reading?" she asked, because she was curious about him in a way that had been growing slowly and that she was only just beginning to acknowledge. He held it up. "Emerson," he said. She stared at him. "You are reading Emerson in a barn in Kansas in 90-degree heat." "The barn is cooler than outside," he said reasonably, "and Emerson keeps good company." She came closer and looked at the book. The volume was heavily annotated, the margins full of pencil marks and occasional words. "You've read this many times," she said. "Clara gave it to me when I left Missouri," he said. "She said if I was going to go off and be a cowboy, the least I could do was read something worth reading." Celia reached out and touched the spine of the book lightly. "I read," she said. "I have a collection my mother started. She was a great reader." "What do you read?" "History mostly, some poetry. I read Whitman when my father was ill. It helped, though I couldn't have told you then why." Joel was quiet for a moment, looking at her with an attention that she was learning was characteristic of him. The way he gave his full focus to whatever he was engaged with, no partial listening, no distracted half-presence. She found it disconcerting in the best possible way because she was not accustomed to being listened to entirely. "There is a traveling library wagon that comes through Abilene every other month," he said. "I have been before. We could go together." "You have been to a library wagon," she said. "I am a man of many surprises," he said simply, and returned to his book. Celia stood in the barn doorway for a moment, watching him read in the amber light of the late afternoon, and felt something shift inside her chest, some interior furniture being quietly rearranged. She went back to the house and served the supper and thought about it. They went to Abilene in early July, which was a full day's ride in the wagon, and Celia packed food for the road with the same competent attention she brought to everything, and Joel handled the horses with the ease of a man who understood animals as extensions of his own patience. The town was alive in July, the cattle drives coming through from Texas, the streets full of drovers and merchants, and the constant movement of commerce and ambition that characterized a cattle town at the height of its season. Celia had been to Abilene many times. She saw it clearly for what it was, a town built on beef and money, with all the associated roughness and energy that implied. She also saw the things that the boosters' stories left out, the Chinese workers who lived in the margins of the town's economy, the black cowboys who came north with the Texas herds and were paid less than their white counterparts for the same skill and labor, the injustice baked into the structure of a place that celebrated frontier freedom while distributing it selectively. She thought of this as they moved through the busy streets, and when she said something of it quietly to Joel, he did not dismiss it or redirect her. "It is a contradiction the country has not resolved," he said. "Some men I have worked with on the trail were the best hands I have ever seen, and they were treated as something other than equal in every town we passed through. It does not sit right." "No," she said, "it doesn't." They found the library wagon at the edge of town near the feed yards, a converted freight wagon with shelves built along its interior walls, and a proprietor of remarkable enthusiasm, named Mrs. Adelaide Cross, who ran the venture with her husband as a way of distributing reading material through a part of the country that had more distance between bookshops than was ideal. Celia spent an hour in the wagon and came out with 3 books and a feeling of contentment she hadn't experienced in longer than she could remember. Joel emerged with 2 additional volumes of Emerson and a collection of letters by Abraham Lincoln. They ate lunch at a diner on the main street, a proper sit-down affair that was unusual enough for either of them on a regular Tuesday that Celia felt a small warmth at the novelty of it. The food was good, basic but well made, and they sat at a table by the window where the street was visible, and the whole spectacle of a cattle town in full operation provided a constant backdrop. "What are you thinking about?" Joel asked. She looked at him. It was a question that implied he had been watching her face. She was becoming aware that he watched her face frequently, not in the unnerving way of a man who is assessing you, but in the way of someone genuinely interested in what is happening inside another person. She was not entirely certain what to do with this. "I am thinking about how strange it is to be sitting in a diner in Abilene with a husband I have known for 3 months, she said honestly, because she had agreed to plain speaking and she intended to mean it. "Strange in what way?" he asked, and his tone invited the full answer. "Strange in the way that it is better than I expected," she said carefully. "Which makes it complicated." He looked at her with that full attention of his. "Why does better than expected make it complicated?" She turned her water glass slowly in her fingers. "Because I arranged myself not to expect much," she said. "It was easier that way, and now I am reconfiguring." Joel was quiet for a moment. "I arranged myself the same way," he said at last, and she looked up at him. His eyes were honest and somewhat undefended in a way she hadn't quite seen from him before. "I told myself this was practical, a good arrangement with a capable woman. I had reasons not to believe in much else." "What reasons?" she asked. He looked out the window at the street. "There was a woman in Texas," he said. 3 years ago I believed it was something genuine she did not, Or rather, she found something more established than a cowhand with savings and ambitions she considered insufficient. He paused. I decided after that to expect less. Celia absorbed this. She understood it precisely. The self-protective logic of it was something she recognized in herself. And now, she said, he looked back at her. And now I am also reconfiguring, he said. They looked at each other across the diner table with the noise of Abilene outside, and the summer heat pressing at the windows, and the silence between them feeling like the most significant thing that had happened in the space of their whole arrangement, which, Celia thought, it probably was. She reached across the table and touched the back of his hand briefly, just one moment of deliberate contact, and then pulled her hand back and looked out the window. "We should look at the cattle prices while we're here," she said. "We should," he agreed, and she could hear in his voice that he understood that she needed the conversation to move somewhere more manageable, and he moved it there without making her feel as though she had retreated. That was July. August came in hot and golden and full of work, the kind of work that a cattle operation in full summer required, which was relentless and physical and satisfying in the way only hard physical labor can be satisfying, when the body knows exactly what it has done by the end of the day. Celia and Joel worked the property with a growing synchrony, the kind that develops between people who have learned each other's rhythms without making a formal study of them. She noticed that he always checked the fence line on the eastern edge near Teller's Creek first, because that was where the herd preferred to drift and where the posts were oldest. She noticed that he made 3 cups of coffee in the morning even though he only drank one himself, because he had observed that she drank 2. She noticed that he never assumed authority over decisions that were hers to make, that he offered information and perspective, and then waited. She noticed these things the way you notice a slowly rising tide, at first barely, and then all at once with the full weight of its depth. One evening in the 3rd week of August, a thunderstorm came in from the west with the speed and drama that Kansas storms were capable of, the sky turning green-yellow to the southwest, and the wind picking up suddenly, and the temperature dropping 10 degrees in what felt like minutes. Celia had seen these storms all her life, and she felt the adrenaline of them as a kind of aliveness. But she also knew what they could do to a roof that was newly repaired and a herd of 23 cattle who had not been moved to the northern pasture shelter yet. They moved the cattle together in the wind and the first splattering of heavy drops, riding hard on either side of the herd, communicating mostly through gesture and proximity. And it was in that shared urgency that Celia felt something crystallize that had been forming slowly for weeks. There was something about working alongside someone in difficulty, she thought, breathless and wet and focused, that revealed the truth of a person more quickly than any amount of careful dinner conversation. Joel Easton in an emergency was exactly the same man he was at the kitchen table. He did not become someone else under pressure. He remained himself, steady and focused and present. She found that to be one of the most remarkable things she had ever encountered in another person. They got the cattle to shelter and made it back to the house just as the storm broke fully overhead, and they came through the front door laughing and dripping water onto the floorboards with the wind rattling the windows all around them. "The new shingles held," Joel said, looking up at the ceiling with an expression of genuine satisfaction. "They did," she said. She was pushing wet hair back from her face, and she was aware that she was standing very close to him in the front room with the storm outside and the lamplight warm and low around them. He looked at her then, and it was not the same kind of looking as before. Something had changed in it, had moved from the careful observation she was familiar with to something more openly felt, and she felt it in her whole chest. She kissed him. She decided to, and she did it, because Celia Covington was not a woman who waited for things to happen to her, and because she was quite certain in that moment of exactly what she wanted and who she was standing in front of. He went still for just 1 second, and then he kissed her back with a warmth and a thoroughness that told her he had been waiting for her to decide, that he had not pressed because he was that sort of person, the kind who waits for you to come to your own conclusions. And when she pulled back and looked at him, His expression was open and unguarded in a way she had not seen from him before and found she wanted to see again. "Celia," he said. "Do not make it complicated," she said, though she was almost smiling. "I was not going to," he said. "I was going to say that I have wanted to do that since approximately the second week of April." She laughed again, the good free kind, and he smiled at her with his whole face, and the storm continued outside, and the cattle were safe and the roof was holding. And she thought that this, specifically this, was what it felt like when something became real. September brought the first chill of autumn, and with it a letter from Clara Easton in St. Louis that arrived on a Wednesday morning, and made Joel read through it twice at the kitchen table before he looked up at Celia with something that was both delighted and slightly embarrassed. "What does she say?" Celia asked. "She wants to visit," he said. "Oh," Celia said, and she felt the small anxiety of it, this woman who was important to Joel, who had known him all his life, coming to see what he had made of himself out here and who he had married in it. She smoothed her hands on the tablecloth. "When?" "October," he said. He was watching her face in that way he had. "She is going to love you," he said. "You cannot know that." "I know Clara," he said, "and I know you. It is a reasonable conclusion." Clara arrived on the 15th of October on the twice-weekly stage from Abilene. A small, bright-eyed woman of 24 with dark hair and her brother's directness, and none of his reserve. She came through the door of the farmhouse and took stock of everything in the space of about 30 seconds with a thoroughness that Celia recognized as a family trait, and then she looked at Celia and smiled. "You're exactly as he described," she said. "I am not certain whether that is reassuring or alarming," Celia said. Clara laughed, which was a wonderful laugh, unrestrained and warm. "He said you were clever," she said. He was correct. Over the 2 weeks of Clara's visit, something important happened to the farmhouse. It became, more fully than it had been before, a home. Not because Clara brought anything external to it, but because her presence drew out something in both Celia and Joel that was softer and more domestic than their working partnership usually required. They played cards in the evenings, and Clara told stories about Joel at 12 years old trying to gentle a horse twice his size with what she called an absolute conviction that the horse would eventually respect his logic. "It worked," Joel said. "It took 4 hours," Clara said. "Patience is a virtue," Joel said, glancing at Celia with something in his eyes that was meant specifically for her, a reference to 4 months of careful, patient waiting. Celia raised her eyebrow at him. He looked back at his cards with a small smile. One evening when Joel was doing the last check on the cattle, Clara sat with Celia at the kitchen table over the remnants of supper and said, with the directness she shared with her brother, "He has not been happy in a long time, since before Texas, really. Since the farm went and he had to start over." She looked at Celia carefully. "He is happy now. I want you to know I can see that." Celia was quiet for a moment. "I am happy," she said, and the simplicity of saying it surprised her a little. "I did not expect to be." "Joel is the kind of person who deserves to be loved entirely," Clara said. "Not halfway or conveniently or around the edges. Entirely." "I know that," Celia said. "I am working toward it," Clara smiled. "I think you are closer than you believe," she said. After Clara left, the farmhouse was quieter, but it was a different quiet than it had been in the early months, a settled quiet, the kind that lives in a place that knows what it contains. Celia and Joel moved through it together with a comfort that had grown gradually and was now simply the texture of their daily life. They worked the autumn cattle sale in Abilene in early November, which went well, better than either of them had projected, and the return from the sale cleared the remaining operational debt from Edmund Covington's estate with enough margin left to make real plans for the spring. On the ride home from Abilene in the wagon with the proceeds safely deposited in the Harlan's Creek Bank, the sky overhead was the hard blue of a November afternoon, and the plains stretched out in all directions in their late autumn colors, fawn and rust, and the pale yellow of dead grass. "We should expand the herd in the spring," Joel said. 30 cattle this time, maybe more if the spring grass holds." "We should fix the barn roof first," Celia said, "before we bring in more animals." "Agreed," he said. "And I was thinking about the north pasture. There is good land there that isn't being used. We could fence it off for the spring calves." "I had the same thought in August," she said. "I didn't bring it up because we had enough going on." He looked at her. "You can always bring things up." "I know," she said. "I am learning to believe that more fully." He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the wagon seat, not a dramatic gesture but a simple one, his thumb running over her knuckles with a familiarity that was becoming so natural between them that it felt like it had always been there. "I am going to spend a great deal more effort making this a real marriage," he said. "It is a real marriage," she said. "A more obviously real one," he said. "The kind that is not convenient at all." She turned to look at him, and he was looking back at her with that warmth she had come to think of as specifically his, something she could not have described adequately to anyone who had not sat across from him by lamplight and watched his face when he thought something was worth feeling. "I believe you are already succeeding at that," she said. He squeezed her hand. The wagon rolled on across the plains toward home. December came with cold and wind, and the particular intimacy of a house that seals itself against the winter and turns inward. The cattle were moved to winter pasture, and the daily labor shifted from the broad physical work of summer to the close work of maintenance and repair. And the evenings lengthened, and the lamplight became the center of the house in a way it was not when the days were long. Celia found herself, on a Tuesday evening in the middle of December, sitting by the fire with one of her mother's books open in her lap, and Joel in the chair across from her with his Lincoln letters, and the fire crackling between them and the wind pressing at the house walls, and she looked up from her book at him, and the whole fact of it settled over her like something she had not realized she had been waiting for. "Joel," she said. He looked up. "I love you," she said. She said it the way she said everything, plainly and with the full weight of her meaning behind it, because she had promised plain speaking, and she intended to keep that promise on all subjects, including this one, which was the most important subject she had ever applied plain speaking to in her life. He was quiet for a moment, and she watched his face do something complicated and then simplify into something clear. He set his book down on the table beside him and looked at her. "I have loved you for a very long time," he said. "Since before the storm, probably. Since the roof. Since the feed store, if I am being entirely honest, because you shook my hand like a person who expected to be taken seriously, and I knew right then that you were the sort of woman I had been looking for without knowing I was looking." Celia stood up and crossed the room and sat down on the arm of his chair, and he looked up at her with his whole heart showing on his face, and she put her hand against his jaw and said, "For a man who proposed a practical arrangement, you are a remarkably impractical person underneath." "I have always been better at the heart of things than the surface of them," he said, and he turned his face slightly into her palm. She kissed him again, but this time it was nothing like the first time in the storm, which had been impulsive and electrified. This was something slow and sure, the kind of kiss that knows it has time, that does not need to prove anything, that is simply the full, honest expression of two people who have found each other through practical necessity, and ended up somewhere neither of them had had the courage to map at the outset. The winter deepened, and they were settled in it together, and the cold outside only made the warmth inside more apparent by contrast. Harlan Bode made one more attempt, because men like Harlan Bode invariably did. In February of 1875, he sent a representative to present a claim on the water rights to the section of Teller's Creek that bordered the eastern edge of the property, arguing that a riparian agreement signed in 1869 gave his family's original land grant precedence over the Covington deed in relation to creek access. It was a more sophisticated legal argument than the fraudulent note, and Celia and Joel took it seriously. They rode to Dodge City in the third week of February to meet with Thomas Mercer in person, which was a 2-day ride each way, and which required them to stay 2 nights at a boarding house in a town that was significantly livelier than Harlan's Creek, with the kind of lively that came from its position at the end of the cattle trail, and the associated industries of entertainment and commerce that catered to drovers at the end of a long ride north. Thomas Mercer was a lean, methodical man of 55 who had practiced law in Kansas since before the war, and who had a way of listening to the full recitation of a legal problem before he said anything that Celia appreciated enormously. When she and Joel laid out the details of the Bode claim in his office, he listened without interruption and then sat back and pressed his fingertips together. "The 1869 agreement does exist," he said. "I have seen similar documents from that period. However, the critical question is whether it survived the subsequent transfer of the Covington property. When your father acquired the land in 1861, the water rights were bundled with the deed, and the 1869 grant would need to have been recorded as an easement against the Covington deed specifically to be enforceable. Do you have your original deed?" "I have it at home," Celia said. "Bring it to me," Mercer said. "If there is no recorded easement, Bode has nothing." They returned home, retrieved the deed from the locked box in the bedroom where Celia had kept it since her father's death, and rode back to Dodge City the following week. The deed had no recorded easement. Thomas Mercer filed the appropriate legal response. Harlan Bode's representative withdrew the claim within 30 days. When the letter confirming the withdrawal arrived, Joel set it on the kitchen table and Celia read it and then folded it neatly and put it in the document box and turned to look at her husband. "That is the last of it," she said. "Do you think he'll try again?" Joel asked. "Not now," she said. "He has spent money on 2 failed claims. Men like Bode are ultimately rational about their costs. We have become too expensive to pursue." She paused. "Also, I intend to write a letter to the county assessor documenting both attempts. Having that on record is a useful deterrent." Joel looked at her with the expression she thought of as the Emerson look, the one he got when he was quietly appreciating something. "Have I mentioned," he said, "that you are magnificent?" "Not in those words," she said. "Magnificent," he said again, and the look on his face made the word feel like something more than a compliment, like a statement of lasting fact. She crossed the kitchen and kissed him, which by March of 1875 she did with the ease and naturalness of a woman entirely at home in her own life. Spring came again, the second spring, and with it all the returned urgency of the land. They expanded the herd to 32 cattle in April, buying 12 additional animals from a seller in Salina who had good stock and fair prices. They fenced the north pasture as they had planned, and Joel built an additional shelter in the corner nearest the creek that could handle the spring calves when they arrived. Celia planted the kitchen garden earlier this year, a week earlier than last, because she had observed the previous year that the late April frosts were less severe than she had always assumed, and she wanted a longer growing season. She planted more than last year, an expanded row of beans and a second row of tomatoes, and on an impulse that pleased her, a section of sunflowers along the eastern fence that had no practical agricultural purpose, but that she wanted for the fact of them. "Sunflowers," Joel said when he saw them going in, coming to stand beside her in the warm April afternoon. "For looking at," she said. He smiled. "Good reason," he said. In May, she knew she was expecting a child. She was certain before she said anything, because she was methodical about certainty. And she waited until she was sure, and then she told Joel on a Sunday evening after supper when the last light was on the land, and the cattle were moving slowly in the lower pasture, and everything around them was in the full green abundance of a Kansas spring. He was quiet for a full 10 seconds, which was long enough that she began to form a response to several different possible reactions, and then he said, "Celia," in a voice that had something in it she had only heard from him once or twice before, the sound of someone feeling something larger than words wanted to contain. "Yes," she said. He took both her hands in his. "I am going to be a father," he said, as if he were reading the words off the horizon and finding them remarkable. "In November, by my reckoning," she said. He pulled her into his arms and held her with a care that was attentive and warm and also entirely unable to contain the feeling in it, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and let herself be held, which was something she was only just learning to do completely, to receive it without management or reservation. "Clara will be impossible about this," she said into his shoulder. He laughed against her hair. "Entirely impossible," he agreed. He wrote to Clara that evening, a letter of such undisguised happiness that Celia, who read it before it was sealed because he had asked her to check for errors, and she could tell the grammar was considerably more emotional than usual, felt a warmth in her chest that sat there like the best kind of ache. The summer was good, better than the first. The expanded herd was healthy, the spring calves were thriving, and the Kansas summer, with all its pressing heat, was also full of the green abundance that came from adequate spring rain, which had been generous that year. Celia worked the property throughout the pregnancy with the same capability she had always brought to it, modifying the physical aspects of the work as the summer progressed and her body required adjustments, and she did not pretend otherwise when adjustments were needed, because she had learned, through Joel, and through the year they had spent building something real between them, that asking for help was not a diminishment but a different kind of capability. Joel adapted alongside her without making production of it, shifting labor between them with a matter-of-factness that she appreciated, because it treated the pregnancy as a natural condition to be accommodated rather than a crisis to be managed. He took on more of the fence work and the heavy lifting. She took on more of the accounting and the correspondence with cattle buyers that their growing operation was beginning to require. They functioned, she thought, with the easy efficiency of people who had genuinely understood each other's strengths. There were evenings in that summer when they sat on the porch after the day's work, the sky going pink and then red and then deep blue above the plains, and said very little because very little needed to be said. And Celia thought about where she had been a year ago, standing outside Silas Drummond's office with her courthouse face on, and a debt hanging over the land her father had loved, and she could not quite make the line between that woman and this one feel continuous. It felt more like a before and an after, with the marriage at its center, but not the marriage as she had understood it when she signed the contract. The marriage as it had become, which was not convenient in any way, not even slightly, which was warm and argued and funny and honest and more than she had known to want. "What are you thinking about?" Joel asked, which was a question he asked her frequently and that she had come to love because it meant he was watching and wondering about her interior life. "About how well things have turned out," she said. He reached for her hand. "They are going to keep turning out well," he said. "I intend to see to it." "Is that a promise?" she asked. "It is a fact," he said. "I just haven't finished making it yet." The baby came on the 3rd of November, 1875, with the first cold of late autumn already in the air, and the fire burning bright in the kitchen stove, and Clara, who had arrived 2 weeks early from St. Louis because she would not have missed this for anything in the world, keeping the water hot in Celia's hand, held with a grip that Celia was grateful for in the hard hours. Joel was in the house, which was not what the midwife, a formidable woman named Mrs. Garrett, strictly preferred, but he was in the house in the front room where he could be heard pacing with a regularity that Celia found, between the difficulties of labor, darkly amusing and also deeply comforting. The baby arrived at 11 at night and was a boy, which Mrs. Garrett announced with the satisfaction of a woman who considered a healthy birth the most conclusive victory available in her profession. And Clara came to tell Joel, and Celia could hear his voice from the bedroom through the wall, a single sharp exhale of relief, and something that she thought might have been the sound of a man finding out his whole heart was still bigger than he'd known. When he came in and she put the baby in his arms, this small dark-haired person who was new to the world and completely certain of his own opinions about it, his face did the thing she loved, the thing where all the reserve fell away and what was underneath was simply the truest version of himself, open and overwhelmed and present. "Hello," he said to the baby softly, as if they were being introduced. The baby regarded him with the unfocused solemnity of the newly born. "Edmund," Celia said. "For my father." Joel looked at her over the baby's head. His eyes were bright. "Edmund," he said. "Yes, that is exactly right." Clara was holding the doorframe with both hands, crying freely and not apologizing for it. "He has your eyes," she said to Joel. "He has Celia's chin," Joel said, "which means he will be entirely unstoppable." Celia laughed from the bed, exhausted and full of a happiness that was so uncomplicated in that moment that it felt like something almost physical, like the air itself was made of it. Edmund Joel Easton was declared by everyone who encountered him to be a baby of considerable character and strong opinions, which were demonstrated primarily through volume. He was also, in the quieter moments, so thoroughly himself that Celia sometimes sat and watched him with the same quality of attention that Joel had always given to her, the full interested attention of someone encountering something worth understanding. Clara stayed for 3 weeks, and during those 3 weeks the farmhouse was full of people and noise and good food, and the particular happiness that comes from a family discovering its own shape. On the last evening before Clara's departure, she and Celia sat in the kitchen after Joel had gone to check the cattle with Edmund asleep in the bedroom, and Clara said, "When he first wrote to me about the arrangement, I worried for him. I worried it would be another way of protecting himself from something real. Instead," Celia said, "instead he sent me a letter in July that barely mentioned the cattle at all," Clara said. "That was when I stopped worrying." "I did not make it easy for him in the beginning," Celia said. "He did not expect easy," Clara said. "He expected honest. You gave him that from the first day, I think." "He gave me the same," Celia said. "That is what I did not expect. That is what changed everything." The winter of 1875 was cold and long, and the farmhouse was warm and full of the life that had accumulated in it over the year and a half of this marriage that had started on a Thursday morning in April with 2 people who had agreed to plain speaking and ended up, through the slow, honest work of days and shared labor and storms weathered together, somewhere neither of them had had a name for at the start. By February of 1876, the herd was healthy and the north pasture fence was solid, and the barn roof had been replaced entirely the previous autumn before the first snows, and the farmhouse had a second bookshelf that Joel had built in November to accommodate the overflow from Celia's collection, which had expanded through 2 visits to the library wagon in Abilene, and several mail orders that Mrs. Adelaide Cross had been delighted to facilitate. Joel was sitting at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning in late February, doing the accounts, which was something they shared between them in a rotation that had developed naturally over the previous year, and Celia was nursing Edmund in the chair by the window, with the light coming in at a low winter angle across them both. "The spring cattle sale will put us in a strong enough position to buy the Henderson parcel," Joel said, without looking up from the ledger. The Henderson parcel was 15 acres adjacent to their northern border that had come available when old Harold Henderson had decided at 72 that he was moving in with his daughter in Kansas City. "I have been thinking the same thing," Celia said. 55 acres with access to the upper reach of Teller's Creek," Joel said, "and better winter shelter for the northern pasture," she said. "Harold always had the best windbreak on that side of the creek." Joel set down his pen and looked over at her and the baby in the morning light, and the expression on his face was the one she thought of now as simply his face, the true one, the one he wore when he was entirely at ease. "I want to spend the rest of my life looking at this exact thing," he said. Celia looked at him from across the room with Edmund warm and heavy in her arms. "This exact thing is available to you on an ongoing basis," she said. "I am aware," he said. "I intend to take full advantage of it every day." She smiled at him, the full, unreserved smile she had learned over the course of this year to give without calculating whether it was wise. "Go back to your accounts, Joel." "Yes," he said, but he looked at her for another moment before he did. The spring of 1876 came in warmer than the previous year, which was good for the calves and good for the kitchen garden, and good for the general mood of a property that was, by any honest assessment, thriving. They bought the Henderson parcel in April, which meant that Celia Covington's land, the 40 acres her father had built with his whole working life, had now grown to 55 and was producing at a rate that covered its operational costs, paid its hands, and left a margin for the kind of planning that was the true measure of a working ranch. Silas Drummond encountered Celia on the main street of Harlan's Creek in the middle of April, when she had come into town to deposit the proceeds of a small cattle sale and to collect the mail, and he looked at her with the expression of a man confronting evidence that his expectations had been insufficient. "Mrs. Easton," he said, "I understand the property is doing well." "It is doing very well," she said pleasantly. "The Easton marriage has been," he seemed to be searching for a word, "successful," she said, "in every possible meaning of the word." He tipped his hat. She tipped hers back, because Celia had always worn a hat in the Kansas sun, and she continued down the street with the mail under her arm and the deposit receipt in her pocket, and the satisfying knowledge that everything Silas Drummond had arranged for her, as a matter of convenience, had become, through the particular alchemy of two people who had chosen plain speaking and meant it, something so far outside the category of convenient that the word itself seemed inadequate. Among the mail that day was a letter from Clara, which Celia read at the kitchen table before Joel came in for lunch, and which she was still holding when he came through the door. "Clara?" he asked, seeing the letter. "She is expecting," Celia said. "She and Robert. The baby is due in September." Joel stopped in the middle of pulling off his coat. His face opened up entirely. She said nothing in her last letter. She was not certain yet when she wrote the last one, Celia said. She is certain now. She looked at him. "Edmund will have a cousin." Joel sat down heavily in his chair, not with distress but with the feeling of a man who has suddenly had a vista open up in front of him that was larger than the one he expected. "We should go to St. Louis," he said, "in the fall, for the birth." "I was going to suggest the same thing," she said. He reached across the table and picked up her hand and turned it over in his with the familiarity of a man who knew the exact geography of another person. "This family," he said, not completing the sentence, just offering it. "This family," she agreed. The summer of 1876 was the fullest one yet. Edmund was walking by July, an activity he pursued with a focused determination and no particular regard for obstacles, which Joel said was genetic and pointed at Celia, and which Celia said was a Easton quality and pointed back. They laughed about it in the evenings while Edmund navigated the kitchen floor with the confidence of a small explorer who had not yet learned that caution was an option. They hired a hand in June, a young man of 22 named Eli Booth, who had come west from Ohio, and who was steady and capable, and who treated Celia's authority over the property with the matter-of-factness of someone who had simply been raised to understand that competence did not have a prescribed gender. Joel had hired him with the specific observation that he was the kind of person who listened before he spoke, which was, Celia thought, Joel's highest standard of character. The three of them worked the property through the summer, the expanded herd of now 40 cattle, the larger pastures, the growing operation that was becoming something with real scale and solidity. In the evenings, Eli had the bunkhouse that Joel had added to the barn in the spring, and the farmhouse was Celia and Joel's in the particular settled way of a home that knows its own inhabitants. In September, they made the journey to St. Louis to be with Clara, which was the longest Celia had been away from the property since her father's death, and which she found, to her mild surprise, did not produce the anxiety she might have expected. She had left Eli in charge with detailed instructions and a trust that was based on 8 months of evidence. She could leave. The land would be there when she returned. St. Louis in September was a revelation after 2 years of Kansas plains. The city was dense and various, and loud in ways that the open country was not, and Celia walked through it with the interested attention she brought to all new things. They stayed with Clara and her husband Robert in the modest house on Elm Street, where the rooms were crowded with books, and the smell of good cooking was constant. And it was the most comfortable Celia had felt in an unfamiliar place since she could remember, because it was full of people she loved being themselves. Clara's son arrived on the 14th of September and was named James, and Edmund, who was now 10 months old and had strong opinions about most things, regarded his cousin with the measured assessment of a person encountering a rival, and then decided to accept him, which everyone felt was very generous. On the last evening before their return to Kansas, Celia and Joel sat on the front steps of Clara's house in the mild St. Louis evening with the sounds of the city around them, and Joel said, "I did not have this 5 years ago. I did not have any of this." "You built it," she said. "We built it," he said. "I want to be precise about that." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was a gesture that had arrived in their life gradually and that she had never made a ceremony of, which was the best kind of gesture, the kind that just becomes part of the landscape of two people. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" she said. "Tell me." "That April morning when Silas Drummond told me there was another arrangement," she said. "I was so certain I knew exactly what it was going to be. A transaction. A practical solution with a stranger attached to it." "That is fair," Joel said. "That is more or less what I was offering." "And then you said, a marriage is different from a transaction even when it begins as one," she said. "I thought about that for a very long time." He was quiet for a moment. "I believed it when I said it," he said. "I wanted to believe it fully, but I had not quite managed to yet. I believed it more after the first week." "What happened in the first week?" she asked. "You came up the ladder with the shingles," he said. She smiled. "That is what changed your mind." "You did not wait at the bottom," he said simply. "You came up. You did not make it anything other than practical. You just did what needed doing side by side. I thought, this is the kind of person I want to be alongside." The city moved around them in the September dark, full of its own concerns and urgencies, and above it, the same sky that was above Harlan's Creek and the Covington land, and the cattle sleeping in the north pasture spread out broad and infinite and undiminished. They returned to Kansas at the end of September, and the land was exactly as they had left it, and Eli had managed well, and the cattle were in good condition, and the harvest from the kitchen garden had been stored with care, and Celia stood in front of the farmhouse in the late September afternoon and felt the land under her feet the way she always felt it, like something continuous, like the answer to a question that was always being asked. Joel stood beside her. Edmund was on his hip, pointing with the focused interest of a child who had recently returned to a place that was his and was accounting for all of it. "Home," Celia said. "Home," Joel agreed and put his free arm around her. In October, she understood that there would be another child, and this time she told him the same evening she knew, because she had promised plain speaking, and because she no longer had any interest in managing the information before she gave it to him. They were at the kitchen table, and she set down her coffee cup and said, "There will be another baby in the spring." Joel put down his cup too. He looked at her with the open, unguarded warmth that was entirely familiar to her now and that still, reliably, made her feel something uncomplicated and good. "April," he said. "May, I think," she said. He stood up and came around the table and pulled her up from her chair and held her, Edmund already in bed and the house quiet around them and the October wind outside and the fire going. "Two," he said. "Two," she confirmed. "Edmund will be delighted," he said. "He is very managing for his age. He will have opinions about the baby." "God help us," Celia said into his shoulder, and they laughed together in the warm kitchen with the fire and the wind and the good solid fact of everything they had made. The winter of 1876 and 1877 passed in the good full way of winters on a working ranch when the work is satisfying, and the house is warm, and the people in it are where they want to be. They read and played cards and wrote letters and did the maintenance work of the property, and in the long evenings Joel sometimes played the mouth harp that had been his father's, which he had never mentioned before and which produced, Celia thought, the exact right kind of music for a Kansas winter, something that sounded like distance and warmth simultaneously. She asked him once why he had never mentioned it. "I did not play it for years," he said, "after Missouri. It seemed like it belonged to a part of my life I had left behind." He looked at it in his hands. "I found it in my coat pocket when I was unpacking here. I had forgotten I had brought it. Why did you start again?" "Because I was happy enough to want to," he said, and the simplicity of it sat in the room between them like a complete and sufficient answer. The baby came in the second week of May, 1877, on a warm evening, with the last of the day's light going gold across the land, and the smell of the kitchen garden through the open window. This time it went faster and easier, which Mrs. Garrett attributed to experience and constitution, and when it was done and the baby was in Celia's arms, Joel came in and sat on the edge of the bed and they looked at their daughter together. "She is very determined looking," Joel said. "She has your eyes," Celia said. "She will be remarkable. What shall we call her?" He said. Celia looked at the baby, who was looking back at her with the ancient assessing gaze of the newly born. "Margaret," she said, "for my mother." "Margaret," Joel said, and the name settled over the room like something that had always been waiting to be spoken. Edmund, brought in by Eli with the solemnity of a small person being entrusted with important information, regarded his sister with the assessment Celia had predicted, and then reached out and touched her hand with one careful finger, and then looked at his parents as if to confirm that this was in fact his and that he approved, which was so entirely his character that both of them had to look away to compose themselves. The spring of 1877 was the most beautiful one Celia could remember, which she understood was colored by the happiness of the year and the life in the house, but which was also simply true in the observable sense. The grass was green in a way that made the plains look like something from a painting, and the cattle were doing well, and the sunflowers along the eastern fence came in strong and tall and yellow in a row that could be seen from the road, and people passing sometimes stopped to look at them. One afternoon in June, Celia was standing at the kitchen window with Margaret asleep against her shoulder, watching Joel come up from the barn with Edmund on his shoulders. Edmund's hands gripping his father's hair with the full confidence of a child, who has never once doubted that this particular person is entirely reliable as a vehicle. And Joel was saying something to him that made Edmund laugh with the good full laugh of a small child who finds the world enormously pleasing. And the late afternoon light was on all of it, the grass and the house and the man and the boy and the sunflowers in a row against the fence. She thought about the April morning almost 3 years ago when she had stood outside Silas Drummond's office and known she was going to say yes to something she had not chosen, because it was the thing that needed to be done. She thought about what she had expected and what she had been offered in its place, which was not convenience but its complete opposite, which was a life with a person who had spent every day of their marriage making sure that the arrangement they had agreed to became something nothing so small as an arrangement could contain. Joel came through the door with Edmund still on his shoulders and nearly ducked, and then did duck, and Edmund found this very funny. He saw her standing at the window. He set Edmund down, who immediately ran toward the biscuits cooling on the counter with the unerring trajectory of a small person who knew exactly what mattered. Joel crossed the kitchen to her and put his hand against her face, and she leaned into it. "You are very far away," he said. "I am right here," she said. "I'm just thinking about how right here I am." He looked at her with those dark, honest eyes that she had read as good on the first day and had been reading right ever since. "Stay right here," he said. "I intend to," she said, "for the rest of my life if it's all the same to you." "It is," he said. "It very much is." And he kissed her in the kitchen with the baby asleep on her shoulder and Edmund eating biscuits at the counter, and the sunflowers in a row against the fence, and the whole of the Kansas summer coming in through the open window with the smell of grass and distance, and everything that had been built here. on this land, in this marriage that had begun as a matter of convenience and had become, through the slow and certain accumulation of honest days, the most inconvenient and necessary and true thing either of them had ever done. The years that followed were full ones, good ones, written in the substance of a life lived in full. The ranch grew. The herd expanded. Eli Booth stayed on and eventually became a partner in the operation, which Celia had proposed and Joel had seconded, and which Eli had accepted with the quiet dignity of a young man who had not expected to be offered that kind of recognition, and who had more than earned it. The Henderson parcel was followed in 1879 by the purchase of an additional 20 acres to the south that gave the Easton operation a scope that made it one of the more substantial ranches in the Harlan's Creek area. Clara visited every year and sometimes twice, and her son James and Edmund became the kind of cousins who spent summers running the Kansas plains with a freedom and a happiness that Celia watched from the porch with Joel's arm around her and thought, "This is what land is for. This is what all the fighting for it was for." Margaret grew into a person of strong opinion and considerable charm, which her father said was her mother entirely, and her mother said was a diplomatic assessment. Edmund, who was managing and methodical, and who had Joel's steadiness and Celia's organizational intelligence in a combination that seemed almost unfair, announced at the age of 6 that he intended to run the ranch, which was received by everyone as entirely plausible. In the fall of 1880, Celia sat on the porch in the October afternoon with a cup of coffee and the copy of Emerson that Joel had read to her from enough times that the pages had her pencil marks in the margins alongside his, and she watched the cattle moving in the lower pasture and the sunflowers, now in their 6th year, still tall against the eastern fence, and she heard Joel's boots on the porch boards behind her. He sat in the chair beside her and took the coffee cup from her hands and drank from it, which was a thing he did that she had given up pretending to find anything but entirely endearing, and then handed it back. "Harlan Bode has sold his operation," he said. "I heard it in town. He's moving to Wichita." "Good," she said. "Good," he agreed. The October light was on the grass, and the sky was that deep autumn blue that Kansas did better than anywhere else in the world, and Edmund and Margaret were somewhere in the barn engaged in a project that had involved a great deal of rope this morning, and that she had chosen not to investigate too closely, and the whole of it, every specific and general acre and person and year of it, was hers, was theirs. "Joel," she said. "Yes. Do you remember what you said the first day I showed you the house?" "When I showed you everything that needed fixing," he thought about it, "I said it was a good house that just needed tending." "You did," she said. She looked at him. "You were right about more than the house." He reached over and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with the ease of a man entirely at home in the space of another person. "So were you," he said. "You told me in that feed store that you were going to keep the operation running in any capacity. You said it like a warning." "It was a warning," she said. "It was the best thing anyone had ever warned me about," he said. She laughed, the good free laugh that had been coming more easily every year for the past 6 years. He smiled at her with all of himself, unheld and fully present. The afternoon went on around them. The cattle grazed. The children's voices came from the barn. The sunflowers, this late in October, had gone to seed and stood in their row like sentinels keeping watch over everything that had grown here in this land that was still Celia Covington's land, still in her name just as she had required, and was also Joel Easton's land, and their children's land, and the evidence of what could be built between two people who had promised each other plain speaking, and had kept that promise fully and without reservation. Every day since a Thursday morning in April, when a practical arrangement had walked through the door of something so much larger than what either of them had dared to want.